The United States military is continuing to build force posture in the Middle East for a possible strike on Iran, while diplomats are talking but making little apparent progress. The Olympics have started in Italy, and Israel has a small delegation, including a bobsled team. Hezbollah is making bellicose threats in the north, saying they're not going to put up with the pounding Israel keeps laying down on them much longer, while Hamas in Gaza is refusing to disarm. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Diving right into the news, friends, there are massive American forces deployed in the region within striking distance of Iran, and there is also negotiations going on between U.S. and Iranian diplomats. To briefly review the order of battle arrayed within striking distance of Iran, the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln is in the western Indian Ocean, reinforced by 8 destroyers and at least 2 submarines armed with hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles, which can be launched against ground targets inside Iran. There are also several squadrons of land-based aircraft deployed to United States bases in the region, including B-52 strategic bombers. Now keep in mind that B-1 and B-2 strategic bombers can be launched from their bases in the continental United States to fly literally halfway around the world and strike targets in Iran at any time. This week, reports surfaced that American strike aircraft have also been deployed in bases to Iran's north in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Britain's Royal Air Force has also deployed F-35 aircraft to bases in Cyprus and Qatar, although it is likely that these aircraft are on a defensive mission only. They will be sent up to intercept any ballistic or cruise missiles and drones that Iran fires at British allies in the region, principally Jordan, but they are unlikely to be sent on missions to attack targets in Iran. France also has agreements with several countries to come to their defense if attacked, and they will likely honor those agreements as they have in the past. Now, for that matter, Saudi Arabia has long been one of the top global spenders on defense, while Bahrain and the UAE also have very impressive military and security forces, at least on paper. Israel has helped both of those countries improve their defensive capacity in recent years since they signed the Abraham Accords. And if Iran thinks they can attack any of these countries without them responding, they should think again. Speaking of Israel, the IDF and the Mossad showed the Iranians what they're capable of in the 12-day war last June, and I'm sure there's plenty more of that where it came from. But the problem is that the Ayatollah regime, which rules in Iran, has painted itself into a corner with lies and gaslighting, telling their own people, the international community, and worst of all themselves, one whopper after another about how strong and tough they are. This makes it impossible for them to admit that they're in way over their heads in the situation, and they need to make concessions in order to avoid being crushed. To be fair, they're also being egged on by their quote-unquote allies in Moscow and Beijing, who would be very happy to see America get a bloody nose in a battle with the Ayatollahs. It might not be obvious, but they'd also be perfectly fine seeing the Ayatollahs get blown to smithereens. It's true that the Chinese in particular have a lot invested in the regime, but they also have plenty of bets on plenty of other horses all over this world. And if the regime in Iran falls, it'll be a setback for them, but not a catastrophe. So for now, they're selling the Iranians all the weapons, ammunition, and means of producing more weapons that they can, taking the regime's last remaining foreign currency reserves in exchange for them, while being quite happy to see their main opponent on the global stage, America, spending so much money and expending so much ammunition blasting away at Iran. After all, every Tomahawk cruise missile fired at Iran is a missile America won't have to fire in defense of Taiwan in a year or two, when the People's Liberation Army is liberating the people of Taiwan, whether they want to be liberated or not. That's part of the cold, hard calculus of international relations in this season of history we're in, friends, and you shouldn't expect it to change anytime soon. Speaking of cold, hard calculus, there are, of course, talks being held between diplomats from the United States and Iran as part of an effort to avoid an outbreak of hostilities. The drama that led up to these talks is worth noting, as last Wednesday evening it looked like they'd be called off after other Iranian leaders publicly declared that they were ready to discuss nuclear issues with Washington, but that's all. This followed a statement by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio that the United States is demanding that Iran forego further enrichment of uranium, limit the range of its ballistic missile arsenal, and stop supporting regional proxy terrorist groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Rubio also mentioned the brutal crackdown on protesters in Iran as an area of concern. But as I said before, the Ayatollah regime scornfully rejected the possibility of discussing anything other than nuclear issues. The Trump administration reportedly saw this, correctly in my humble opinion, as a clear signal that holding talks was a complete waste of time. However, as Wednesday night turned into Thursday morning, several governments in the region called the White House dling-ling and asked if the talks go forward anyway, even if everyone can see that the chances of reaching a deal are near zero. So reluctantly and with very low expectations, White House envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were dispatched to Oman for the talks. The talks were initially supposed to happen in Turkey, but the Iranians asked that the venue be changed to Oman so that they could give the appearance of being in control of what's going on. They always like to control everybody and everything. Now, the Trump administration agreed to this without arguing, and I think that actually sent a signal that the administration doesn't really think these talks are going anywhere anyways. So they don't even care anymore whether they happen in one place or another. It's sort of like the diplomatic equivalent of rolling your eyes and saying, yeah, whatever. The Iranians, for their part, also sent signals, both during the talks and afterwards, with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi reportedly telling Witkoff that American expectations that there would be no more uranium enrichment were out of the question and refusing to even discuss any of the other issues that the Americans tried to bring up. The Iranians, for their part, also sent signals, both during the talks and afterwards, with Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi reportedly telling Witkoff to get off and bug off, that American expectations that there would be no more uranium enrichment were out of the question and refusing to even discuss any of the other issues that the Americans tried to bring up. Araghchi, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, later spoke to reporters about the meeting and literally laughed as he was telling them that the Americans had told him Iran must agree to stop enriching uranium, as if the very idea was so ridiculous all he could do was laugh. You gotta hand it to this regime. They don't do anything halfway. And when they decide they're going to be their own worst enemies, they leave no stone unturned. In my humble opinion, they should have learned a lesson from President Trump's reaction to the way Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela publicly taunted him, but some people never learn any lessons until it's too late. For their part, Witkoff and Kushner left the meeting in Oman and proceeded to the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, accompanied by U.S. Central Command Commander Admiral Brad Cooper. For his part, President Trump said that there had been very good talks in Oman and said more talks would happen later this week or possibly next week. Some people are worried that this means he's open to being hoodwinked by the Iranians, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was scheduled this week to make an emergency trip to Washington to meet with President Trump and try and make sure that doesn't happen. Candidly, I think everyone, including Netanyahu, are worrying too much about that. But we'll see. We'll get the full details by the time of this next report. President Trump might not be FDR, but he's not Jimmy Carter either, and the Iranians are very foolish to try and play games with him. I actually think it's likely that he's just going through the motions of these talks to placate America's regional allies and give the U.S. military a little more time to prepare for the inevitable attack. The reports of U.S. forces being deployed in Armenia and Azerbaijan, along with B-52 deployment, lend even more credence to this idea. Why would the Pentagon spend the money to deploy all these assets if there was no serious intent to use them? If all these deployments were just posturing, the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier would be more than enough to serve that purpose. As a footnote, I also think President Trump is going to delay pulling the trigger on the attack until after the Olympics, which began in Italy a few hours after the talks in Oman wrapped up. President Trump might not care much about what the international community thinks, but even he probably doesn't want to be remembered as the president who started a major shooting war in the middle of the Olympic Games. Also, as I said before, time is on America's side in this situation, as the U.S. military continues to prepare for a strike while Iran's military can't do much it hasn't already done to try and defend the regime against what's coming their way. Now, on that note, Israel and other countries in the region, which might be targeted by Iran's ballistic missiles, which is really all they've got that can threaten anyone else, also need some extra time to prepare. Here at Vision for Israel, we are doing our part to help Israel prepare for the possibility of more and more ballistic missile attacks from Iran and the concurrent possibility of more rocket attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, or anyone else for that fact. The Ayatollahs are threatening to, quote, activate the resistance axis, unquote, and not hold anything back this time if they are attacked. That's part of their rhetoric about how in the 12-day war in June they didn't go all out to strike back after Israel devastated their high command, blasted all their ballistic missile launchers, etc. As I said, they've painted themselves into a corner with this nonsense. Now, if you remember, Hezbollah sat out that war, and the Houthis only launched a single ballistic missile at Israel while we were engaged with Iran. The reasons for this are obvious, as Hezbollah has a vastly diminished capacity for action at this point, while the Houthis never had much capacity. But the regime is making their usual fiery speeches about how they held back in June, but this time that they won't, that Israel and America shouldn't try their patience, and so on. Once again, this is a great example of why you shouldn't lie or bluff, even if you think you can get away with it for a while. Someday, someone will come along and call your bluff, and then you'll have nothing but bad options to choose from. Right now, the Iranians are choosing the worst possible option, pretending that they weren't bluffing, that they were really as big and as bad as they've always said they were, and that it's the Americans and Israelis who need to worry about a war breaking out and not them. I have tremendous pity for the long-suffering ordinary people of Iran who recently tried to get rid of this regime by rising up against them before brutally being crushed. Soon the regime will get a chance to find out if they can be as tough when they're up against American and Israeli warplanes, cruise missiles, and strategic bombers as they were against unarmed protesters. Frankly, I don't like their chances. And by the way, we need to pray for the Iranian Christians and the underground church. Now, we'll stay on the topic of security threats for a moment because, of course, there's still an ongoing IDF operation in the Gaza Strip. I'm afraid there hasn't been much movement in this area over the last week. We are supposed to be moving into Phase B, not Phase Barry, Phase B of the ceasefire plan envisioned by President Trump. But that phase involves Hamas disarming, and they don't like that part. They like the parts of Phase B about reconstruction and the withdrawal of the IDF from most of the Strip, but they don't like the part about them disarming. On the other hand, Hamas is expressing willingness, even eagerness, to turn over the civil administration of the Strip over to a technocratic committee which includes the large-scale involvement of the Palestinian Authority. But they are also seeking to place around 10,000 of their own fighters, terrorists, in positions of police forces within this technocratic apparatus, which appears to be a blatant attempt to retain real power while pretending to allow the technocrats to govern the territory. Even by Middle East standards, this is pretty outrageous, and I hope President Trump doesn't allow them to get away with it. He has said on multiple occasions that he will not accept it if they don't disarm, and that there will be no reconstruction in Gaza until they do so. Let's hope he means it. Otherwise, we're probably going to have to go through all this again, another war in a few years. The IDF is also preparing to preempt this possibility by going back in to finish Hamas off for good, and I have my vote 100% for this effort. If the political echelon decides that what should be done and the Americans sign off on it, if this decision is taken, and I'm sorry to say I don't see any other better way to ensure that Hamas is out of the picture once once and for all for good, so the long-suffering people of Gaza and southern Israel don't need to worry about their tyranny and terrorism any longer. As a footnote, if the IDF does go back into Gaza to pursue Hamas, this time they won't have to worry about any Israeli hostages being hit in the crossfire, so the operation will probably be quick. Now, we're not talking about another long, drawn-out campaign, just decisive and overwhelming action, and once again, I vote for it. The sooner the better. Now, I also need to talk about the Israeli economy. The Moody's credit rating agency recently upgraded Israel's outlook from negative to stable, but kept it at Baa+, which is 2 steps down from A2, which is where it was before Moody's issued a downgrade in September of 2024. Now, please don't ask me to explain all of that because I've never really understood this stuff, but the bottom line is clear enough. Moody's expects Israel's economy not to get worse, and that's a signal that many foreign investors will take note of. However, even if investors do begin to once again put money into Israel, it'll take time for this to gain momentum, and in the meantime, many ordinary Israelis are struggling. Another big development this week is likely to cause even more problems for these ordinary people as well as businesses, nonprofits like Vision for Israel, and even the government. I'm talking about the rapid appreciation of Israel's currency, the shekel, which this week reached a historic high of around 3 shekels to the dollar. That sounds like good news, but when Israel's currency gets too strong, the cost of doing business in this country can get to the point where it's no longer profitable for exporters and manufacturers. That means jobs could be lost as factories shut down, and some of the highly skilled workers, particularly in the tech sector and medicine, will leave the country to find work somewhere else where they can earn even more money. This is the infamous brain drain that so many countries are worried about. Now we're almost out of time, so I'm just going to briefly touch on some other big stories that are making headlines in Israel this week. We'll start with Israel's tourism industry, which many of you are interested in, coming to Israel. Now, that industry employs hundreds of thousands of Israelis and indirectly contributes to substantial numbers of other jobs. But in recent years, the industry has been fairly subdued for reasons that require no explanation. In recent months, there's been a noticeable increase in the number of incoming tourists, but it's still nowhere near the numbers that existed before this war started. So if you're watching this and you're wondering if you should visit Israel, now's a great time, because all the places you want to visit won't be so overcrowded. However, Jerusalem, the city with all the amazing great stuff, is one big construction zone right now, so it might be better to check out other areas like the Galilee. It'll be spring soon, and that's the best time to visit the Sea of Galilee region, as it's still cool enough to be outside during the day, and it's also still very gorgeous and green. Now, speaking of rain, we've gotten almost enough this year in Israel. After a late start to winter, it's been cool and even very cold in some places since late November. We've had several days of rain, particularly in the center of the country, but the Kinneret, the Sea of Galilee, is still 23 centimeters below the lower red line, which means there is no water being pumped out of it to feed into the system. On the contrary, desalinated water is being pumped into the Sea of Galilee these days in one of the great triumphs of Israeli technology, as well as being one of the great ironies of the modern world. Now, there's one more big story making headlines in Israel this week that I'm sure regular viewers of this program will be interested in. This past week, steps have been taken by various branches and agencies in the Israeli government that are meant to advance long-standing plans to annex Judea and Samaria and make them officially part of the territory of the State of Israel. Things have gone far enough for President Trump to declare publicly that he does not want things to go any further, and he does not support Israeli annexation of these territories. When an American president, even this one, makes such a public and specific statement, it can only be because there is a very real possibility that this time it might actually happen. I know many of you will be very excited by the prospect of this happening, but I feel I must add a note of caution. Although I believe it is absolutely correct and in order for Judea and Samaria to be annexed to this country, as it is the biblical heartland of Israel, I also know that there are many people who disagree, and that includes literally millions of Israeli citizens, both Arabs and Jews. I also know that the governments of literally every other country in the world, including our closest friends and allies, rabbis are also opposed to it and will do everything they can to stop it. No one anywhere should be under any delusions about how difficult it will be to live through a prophetic season of history, no matter how much we might look forward to the fulfillment of prophecy. Again, let's pray for our leaders and also pray for the people of Judea and Samaria, the citizens of Israel. It's a beautiful area, and you need to visit it sometime when you come to Israel. Now we're out of time for this week's report, but I want to continue the tradition of ending with some good news. So here it is. Israelis were overjoyed this past week to hear that Deni Avdija of the NBA's Portland Trail Blazers has been selected to play in the NBA All-Star Game on February 15th. The 25-year-old Avdija, who grew up on Kibbutz Beit Zera in the Galilee, is now in his second season with the Trail Blazers and still has many years of NBA glory ahead of him. So with that, it is glorious. I'm Barry Segal, and this has been another edition of VFI News from Israel.